Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center and to today's meeting, Nuclear Flashpoints, U.S.-Iran Tension over Terms and Timetables. The Wilson Center, chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Wilson, is the nation's key non-partisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for Congress, the administration, and the broader policy community. The Middle East program at the center has convened its Iran series of meetings and briefings since 1999, and today's event marks the Middle East program's 189th meeting on Iran. Some of you in the audience have been very faithful attendees to all our meetings. I thank you for that. The Wilson Center is hosting today's meeting along with a coalition of 7 Washington think tanks and organizations. The coalition of organizations that put together this series includes the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Wilson Center, the Rand Corporation, the Arms Control Association, the Center for a New American Security, the Stimson Center, the Partnership for a Secure America, and the Plowshare Funds. This is the second in a series of 3 meetings, and the final meeting in the series, Sanctions, the U.S. and Quid Pro Quo, will be held on July 8th at USIP. You will get invitations, but please remember it's going to be on July 8th and at USIP. Today's meeting is moderated by Stephen Hadley. He's the chairman of the board of the U.S. Institute of Peace and chair of Rand Center for Middle East Public Policy. Mr. Hadley served as national security advisor to President George W. Bush, in addition to covering the full range of national security issues. He had special responsibilities on U.S. relations with Russia, Israeli disengagement from Gaza, strategic relations with India, and ballistic missile defense. I'm going to stop here, otherwise I'll be spending the next 10 minutes introducing Mr. Hadley. Welcome to the center, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I want to welcome you all here today. An administrative matter, you will have, each of you in the audience has a packet of basic information you were given as you came in. It includes a fact sheet on the pivotal issues in reaching a nuclear deal with Iran. It gives you the bios on the speakers today and a flyer on the Iran primer, and I'll make a little plug for a USIP enterprise, now the world's most comprehensive website on Iran, which is now running a series on the nuclear diplomacy with Iran. If you have questions, you can talk to Robin Wright, who's been the mover behind that effort. The full bios you have on our various panelists today, I'll just give a brief introduction. John Wolfsthal is Deputy Director of the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Monterey Institute for International Studies. He was Special Advisor to Vice President Biden for Nuclear Security and Non-Proliferation. He was also a Director of the for Non-Proliferation on the National Security Council staff. Welcome. Darrell Kimball has been Executive Director of the Arms Control Association since 2001. He was also Executive Director of the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, a consortium of 17 of the largest U.S. non-governmental organizations working to reduce the threats posed by nuclear weapons. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Rob Litwack is Vice President for Scholars and Director of International Security Studies here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He served on the National Security Council staff as Director for Non-Proliferation in the first Clinton administration. Welcome. I think we could not have 3 better panelists for this session today. The session today is on time and timing issues. Those time and timing issues that will be involved in a nuclear deal with Iran. We will focus on 3 of them today. What should be the duration of any agreement? How much breakout time must an agreement provide? And what is the timing on sanctions relief? And what we hope you will take away from this session is the following: that if we should get a nuclear agreement with Iran, it will not be a one-time event where we'll pop the champagne corks and then everyone goes their separate ways. But the Iran and the international community will have been embarked and at the starting point of what could be a decades-long process of implementing any agreement. And it will be a huge challenge of keeping that implementation process on track throughout a very lengthy period in the face of what will be inevitable tensions and disagreements between Iran and the international community. We've tried this once before, the framework agreement with North Korea in the early 1990s. And the implementation broke down, and the agreement failed, and an opportunity was lost. And hopefully, we will be wise enough this time to embed the lessons we learned from that experience in any agreement that comes out with Iran. So here's how we plan to proceed and use the time today. We'll spend the first 45 minutes for panelists' presentations and discussion. We will then have 35 minutes for questions and answers from the audience, and a final 10 minutes for closing comments from the panelists. The first 45 minutes will be divided into 3 15-minute segments. Each segment will involve a 10-minute presentation by one of the panelists, and then 5 minutes during which the other 2 panelists will comment on that presentation. The 3 presentations along with the presenters will be, first, the duration of any agreement with John Wolfthal. Second, a breakout period with Daryl Kimball. And third, sanctions relief with Rob Litvak. And so with that, John, let's begin with you.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting, and Robin and USIP for organizing, and all the groups for putting this group together. And thank you all for coming this morning. I think my role here is a bit of a table setter to talk about how I try to explain to people what we're about to embark upon. And in order to understand where you're going, cliche, you have to understand where you've been. And so I like to remind people that while we are insatiable for new events, it has been breathtaking what we have gone through in the last year with Iran. The idea that the U.S. president would pick up the phone and call the president of Iran, that we would have teams meeting bilaterally. I remember working in the U.S. government in the 1990s at an international forum where I had to move tables because an Iranian delegate came and sat down at mine, and it wasn't worth all of the hassle when I got home to explain why did I eat a piece of fish next to an Iranian technical expert. So these are just a few of the markers that are in the minds of older Iranians and older Americans as you think about the U.S.-Iranian relationship. Some will mean something to you, some won't. But they mean things to the Iranians, and so they're important to keep in mind that this relationship of tension and engagement goes back over half a century. And the dates themselves are not important. I'm not trying to poke a particular wound here. It's just to say that it took us a long time to get to where we are, and it's not something that's going to be unwound very easily. And so just to keep in mind that there's a long history here. As Stephen said, we have tried to change the fundamental relationship with another country before via a nuclear agreement. And it didn't work out very well. We didn't want to do it that way, but we had a nuclear security imperative, the fact that North Korea was producing weapons plutonium for a weapons program, and we wanted to stop them from doing it. And we said, okay, we're going to swallow hard and deal with this country we don't like because it's in our security interest to do so. because while we have the military means to at least slow down their program or divert their program, that would be really ugly, and so we're going to exhaust every other opportunity. We're not going to relitigate why the agreement with North Korea failed. I think it's enough to say that the circumstances in North Korea are very different than the circumstances in Iran. And from my point of view, the most important difference is Iran wants, at least parts of the Iranian society want to open up, want to engage, and you could make a bet that part of President Rouhani's strategy is to be the person who figures out how to get this new relationship from the United States. That's his political bargain. That's his political play. In North Korea, they wanted to stay closed. They wanted to figure out how they got the money without having to change their system, and that fundamentally didn't work. But in Iran, this desire provides an opportunity, doesn't guarantee success by any means. And I liken this, I have an older brother, everything is, you make it personal. I have an older brother, and we used to play the game. He'd get a cookie from the cabinet, and I'd have a quarter or a dollar. And I tried to get the cookie without giving up the quarter, and he tried to get the money without having to give up the cookie. That's sort of the game we're playing with Iran now. I mean, they have a nuclear cookie. We're trying to get it from them, or at least part of it, in exchange for something. But they don't trust us, and we don't trust them, and neither one wants to be left with nothing in their hands. And so it's a very simplistic way of thinking about a very complicated, dangerous, politically charged environment, but there you have it. And as I think about this, it's not, the language is important. It's not just a question that we lack trust, which we do, but from the Iranian point of view, and this is something that's sometimes hard for Americans to understand, they feel that they're not being treated respectfully. The quote that I've been educated on from President Khatami talking about wanting to have an engagement of great societies, an engagement of great cultures, he meant the West and Iran on equal footing, which is something that some Americans are willing to accept and some Americans are not. But that is part of the undercurrent that we have to keep in mind. And I think we also have to keep in mind, and I think this is where we're really charged with talking today, that the political deck in both countries makes it very, very hard to not only get a deal, but to make it stick. And I'll talk in a minute about why that is. But the parallels of politics in both countries are really remarkable. And so I don't think it's too hard to understand the idea that a president trying to reach out to a regime that's been hostile to it is going to be attacked from the right resonates both in the United States and in Iran, and you definitely see a lot of those similarities. And unfortunately, because of the nature of the relationship and the timelines involved, we are going to be dealing with the nuclear question up front. That's unfortunate, but it's just the card that we've been dealt. So why is this going to take so long? Why are we talking about a deal that might last, I should probably hit the clicker, right? Thank you. Why are we talking about a deal that could last a decade or even more in some aspects? Well, in the joint plan of action and in the language that people are using in government, they're talking about trying to regain confidence in Iran's peaceful intentions. How quickly do you regain trust personally if somebody slights you? If a country behaves in a certain way over a long period of time, how long does it take to finally change your mind and say, oh, you know what, they used to be like that, but now they're like this? It's more than a day. It's more than a month. It takes some time. And the reason that nobody is going to sit here and tell you a deal should last exactly 14 years, 6 months, 12 days is because it's subjective. We're going to know it when we see it, although we're going to argue over whether we're actually seeing what we think we're seeing, because that's what we do. But it is going to be a long period of time. And we're not going to want to give up all of our leverage, the dollar, and Iran is not going to want to give up all of the cookie, their enrichment capability, their production capability, right up front. And these things are going to be staged. And so we're talking about an agreement that's going to last for a while and that is going to be staged and phased in. And what negotiators get paid, probably not enough money, is to figure out, okay, how do these pieces fit together? And I'm not going to sit here and tell you what they're talking about because I don't know for sure. I know what the different pieces are and how they're trying to plug them in, but we can try and have a little bit of Q&A afterwards. I think the real question for me is, can we get an agreement that the United States politically is prepared to support for this administration and into the next, and that the Iranian regime is prepared to stand by once President Rouhani is no longer president? It has to last multiple governments. It has to be sustained over a period. This is what we saw in U.S.-Soviet arms control. This is what we've seen in other types of security negotiations, whether it's alliances or arms control agreements. And are we patient enough? Can we wait that long? That's a real question I think we have to answer. What is interesting and valuable is to the extent that this deal will be linked to Iran's nuclear requirements, what they actually need to produce to sustain their current or planned nuclear program. Right now, their needs are quite small. And to the extent that they grow, they can and currently are being met by outside suppliers. The Russians provide fuel for their one power reactor. They can get fuel assurances or fuel contracts should they decide to build additional power reactors. There's an international fuel bank that's been set up that could provide fuel should an international supplier fail. There are different ways you can phase in this agreement so that their initial needs are actually quite moderate and provide for the breakout time that I think Darrell will talk about. But over the longer term, that may not be possible. But the hope is by then we'll have regained enough confidence, both in transparency and in behavior, that it's still a risk worth taking. So, well, why do we even have to worry about a term-bound agreement? Why don't we just make them be restrained forever? Why don't we just sign an agreement that says you can only have 1,000 centrifuges or 10,000 centrifuges, but that's the permanent state of affairs. And there's nothing that's a permanent state of affairs. And the example that I'd like to use is Iraq. Now, Iran, as they will point out very often, is not Iraq. They are not the loser in a violent military conflict. They are not under a ceasefire agreement. They are entering into this negotiation, from their point of view, voluntarily, which is true. They're under severe sanctions. They're volunteering to negotiate to try to get out from those sanctions, but it's still voluntary. Even in Iraq, where we went to war in 1991, we went to war again in 2003, the nuclear prohibitions that were imposed on that country still lasted 17 years. From 1991 and the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 687 to when they were lifted fully in 2010, 17 years of go anywhere, do anything, or face the consequences. But even that was time-bound. Iraq can now have a nuclear program if they want it. They can build reactors and produce medical isotopes. I don't advise it, but they could. It's something that is, unless we can offer Iran a good enough deal, which we can't, they're going to want to get to what we're calling a state of nuclear normalcy. They want to be treated in the nuclear realm just like any other state under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And our position is, once you stop violating that treaty, and once your intentions are proven and we have confidence in them, you can. That is valuable to us. That they want to get there gives us some leverage and some negotiating power, which we're now trying to use in these negotiations. So just a word or two about phasing, and then I'll start to wrap up. In my mind, it is obvious that the deal is going to be linking the process of sanctions relief and enrichment capability and Iran's nuclear requirements and the extent to which they come clean about their past nuclear behavior. Those are four major elements that are going to have to be like a jigsaw puzzle that are fitted together. Now, there are different elements that we're trying to add to that table. Good negotiators always try to increase their toolbox. And one of the reasons that you see very large negotiating teams and the technical teams of experts, including trade specialists and oil development and energy specialists, is because we're trying to see if we can broaden the playing field. Are they willing to go a certain distance in order to achieve an end result? And if we can sweeten the pot by signing contracts for oil exploration or joint cooperation on nuclear activities that are purely peaceful that we can prove are peaceful, will that make it easier for them to accept more stringent limits for a longer period of time? So we're trying to broaden out that playing field. The issue of sanctions, which I won't get into because I know Rob will, but that's clearly the process by which they are lifted, how quickly can they be reimposed, and when is clearly a very sensitive and critical question that will also be politically charged. One issue that I know the people here are very concerned about is Iran's possible military dimensions. Their past activities that the International Atomic Energy Agency has evidence and reason to believe are linked to a past effort to develop nuclear weapons. How do you trust a country that says, we never tried to do that, when you have all this evidence that suggests they probably did? And how do you satisfy yourself that they have eliminated any vestiges of an ongoing program so that you can feel comfortable with them having enrichment capability? And that's a tough question. My mind requires us to focus in on what are the different pieces of their past that really worry us and how do we resolve those. There's some things they did we can never undo. The fact that they looked at a document that explained how you convert uranium to metal cannot be washed out of their minds. We can track the people. We can see whether they're working at a nice, peaceful university somewhere or whether they're in an underground bunker. That gives us some telltale. There are things that they were alleged to have done that really would advance a nuclear program, development of nuclear components. Those are things we have to get answers to. But do we have to get them on day one? They already have a certain number of centrifuges. If they're going to go from 10,000 to 3,000 voluntarily as part of a deal, do we have to answer all the IAEA questions on day two? Again, the negotiators have to decide where they're comfortable, but that's clearly another thing that's in play. And then in terms of the length of the agreement, again, this is why the negotiators get paid poorly. That's for them to decide. Can they get 15 years? I'd love to get a 30-year deal. The Iranians are not going to accept that. Okay, how about 25? Well, I could do 25 if you give me 10,000 centrifuges more quickly. No, I don't like that. Okay, how about 20? I mean, that's really the process we're going through. It's not that dissimilar from any other sort of negotiation. In this case, there are just a lot more people watching. So last point, and then I'll wrap up. Pitfalls. And you can bet on them. These are things that are going to happen because they have happened before, they've happened to other agreements, and I could write the talking points for both the critics of the agreement and the supporters of the agreement for how this is going to play out. Somebody will stand up and say, they lied. They didn't tell you about site X. It's in the mountains. It's at this location. Well, how good a deal have we negotiated? If they're under the additional protocol of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they're under additional transparency measures that are voluntary as part of a P5+1, can we go there? Do we have to have a lot of evidence to go there, or can we just say, you know, we're concerned about this site in the mountains, we'd like to go there? We tried that with North Korea. Eventually, even in a very difficult place to get to, where we were concerned the North Koreans were building a brand new nuclear reactor, Kumchong-ni, we negotiated a way to get in there. Turns out it was an empty hole. Now, had they stripped things out because it took 2 years to get there? Maybe. But we have that process. But we know this is going to be coming. What are the people doing? Right? There was just a report last week or 2 weeks ago that the Iranians had kept this cadre of nuclear scientists together. They were doing secret work on a weapon, and we couldn't get to them. Well, how good a deal do we have? And then as you move forward, even if you have a good deal, the Iranians are negotiating with us to get sanctions relief. How are we going to stop or try to stop, or do we want to try to stop the American Congress or the French Assemblée Nationale or the British government from saying, in response to a terrorist attack linked to people supported by Iran, we're going to impose sanctions on the banking sector anew? Unrelated to nuclear, but because they've been bad guys, we're going to use this tool that was very effective in the nuclear realm to hit them for something else: missiles, terrorism, other activities. And we've seen this in the past. The president cannot write a letter that says, I promise to veto any legislation that the Congress passes that imposes new sanctions on Iran. He can provide assurances, I will work against them, I will talk against them, but if there's a terrorist attack that Iran is linked to, that's a very difficult thing to do. So, we shouldn't forget who we're dealing with and what a bumpy road this is going to be. And then in the end, these things are going to happen. And the president is going to have to judge, okay, something has happened. Is that violation, is that alleged violation, is that activity worth losing the whole deal over? And this is why people are rightfully nervous about accepting a deal that isn't perfect, right? Governments, Republican, Democrat, conservative, progressive, when they stand by a deal, inertia takes over, momentum takes over. You don't want to throw that out because then you have a big problem to deal with. So if we've run into a violation, and Iran is going to try and push the limits, just as we are going to try and push the limits, at what point do you say it's not worth it anymore? And do you say it's not worth it anymore at the beginning, or do you say, you know what, this isn't working, let's go back and rework this deal? Those are things that are going to happen over time, and we have to prepare ourselves for a very long, very difficult period where we have to stay focused on what it is we want. And what we want is for Iran not to have nuclear weapons, and for Iran not to have the ability to rapidly produce nuclear weapons. And what is that worth to us? And do we have other means to achieve that? The government may change in 20 years, and maybe they decide, you know what, we really like Disneyland more than we like centrifuges. They probably like both. But But time is going to be on our at least we believe time can be on our side if we can negotiate binding limits that restrict their ability to pursue this technology in a way that damages our interests. And that's really what this is about and what we have to prepare ourselves for. So,
John, thank you. Terrific start. Let's go straight into Daryl's presentation on the breakout period.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Wilson Center and our partner organizations in organizing this series. It's an honor to be here. And I'm going to be, as Steve mentioned at the top, talking about a couple of the critical timelines relating to how we understand the concept of breakout and how the agreement can reduce or I should say increase the amount of time it would take Iran to pursue nuclear weapons. So, but first of all, it's obvious that this is a critical moment, and the negotiators have less than a month to go or about a month to go before the July 20 deadline they've set. It's a historic opportunity, as John outlined. We've been working at this for many, many years, and so it's important, I think, to try to wrap this up. But what does wrapping this up mean, and how do we judge what a successful comprehensive agreement might look like? So a couple thoughts on this that speak to this breakout concept. So in my view, and I think in the view of a lot of nonproliferation experts, at the basic level, a successful agreement is going to roll back Iran's overall enrichment capacity, block the plutonium path to the bomb, which is mainly through the Arak reactor, put in place tougher international inspections, and resolve the outstanding issues about possible military dimensions to Iran's program. And then it must also remove the nuclear-related sanctions, as John mentioned, and as Bob is going to talk about further. So for the United States in particular, zeroing in on the breakout issue, one of the most fundamental goals is, with or without this agreement, how do we decrease the time it would take Iran to try to break out of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and try to build nuclear weapons if it were to do so? And just as important, we need to think about how we can improve international inspections and monitoring to decrease the time needed to detect and disrupt any such effort. And that's important, as I'll say in a minute, because we also have to worry about an illicit program, not just the work at the known facilities. So Steve asked how much time is necessary to guard. I have a simple answer, which may not be satisfactory, but I think it's a good rule of thumb. How much time must be built in to guard against an Iranian nuclear bomb? More than we currently have, and I'll talk about how much time it would take Iran today, roughly, and enough time to detect and, if necessary, disrupt any such effort. It's the combination of these two things. So a little bit on how we look at this issue of breakout, which is thrown around in the debate about the Iran nuclear issue so much. Couple fundamental things. The U.S. intelligence community, as dating back to 2007, has assessed that Iran already has the scientific, technical, and industrial capacity to produce nuclear weapons if it wants to. They've also assessed that if they were to do so, it's more likely that Iran would pursue this by means of an undeclared secret facilities, which is a scenario that we call sneak out as opposed to breakout. And so there are a lot of different factors involved in how do we guesstimate how long it might take Iran to get nuclear weapons. And most start with how much time would it take Iran to amass a significant quantity of fissile material, in this case highly enriched uranium, necessary to make one bomb. But having enough fissile material for one bomb does not make an especially effective or credible nuclear deterrent. And if Iran were to want multiple weapons, that would require additional time to produce that additional amount of fissile material. And while we focus on this timeline for producing a sufficient quantity of fissile material, because it's arguably the most resource-intensive, difficult, and visible stage of the nuclear weapons production process, there are, of course, other significant hurdles. Designing and constructing an explosive device, integrating that into a delivery system, in Iran's case, probably a ballistic missile, and over the long term, possibly an explosive nuclear test or several so that they have a better understanding of whether their design operates as they expect. So real-world timelines also have to take into account the real-world legal and political factors inside and outside Iran. One of the issues that the Iranians leaders would have to consider if they pursue nuclear weapons is what justifies this pursuit. Just yesterday, the Supreme Leader made another speech condemning nuclear weapons as being inconsistent with human values and the Islamic religion. So, and then finally, the success or failure of a breakout attempt depends on the quality and scope of the inspections regime, the ability of the international community to respond effectively and to disrupt breakout, which involves a number of considerations about how much time that would take, and the number, as I said, of nuclear weapons that Iran thinks would be an effective deterrent. But let's get to this issue of how much time we think Iran would need to produce enough fissile material for one device, and how could this be, the different ways in which this can be judged. Iran currently has about 10,200 first-generation centrifuges. And if it were to use its current stockpile of 3.5% enriched uranium, which is about 8,000 kilograms at the moment, it would take about 2 to 3 months, probably on the 3-month end, if not detected and disrupted first. Another way to think of this is with the same number of centrifuges, but without that 3.5% stockpile, the amount of time it would take would double to about 6 months. With half the number of IR-1 centrifuges, if the deal can arrive at this point, and a near zero stockpile of the 3.5% enriched uranium, the time would be extended to a 12-month. And there are other variations that might be negotiated. And so, in other words, what I'm trying to point out is that the negotiators are dealing with several key variables in this negotiation relating to this fissile material production timeline, and those are the number and type of centrifuges, the stockpile of 3.5% enriched material, and whether these machines are installed and tested and operating or in storage or are somehow disconnected. So these are complex issues. That's why in the last session, the Iranian nuclear negotiations were referred to as a Rubik's Cube, and there's no one path to solving the Rubik's Cube. Now, how can the two sides come to some agreement on these issues? First of all, I'm focusing on the uranium enrichment problem because the two sides appear to have found common ground on ways to reduce Iran's potential to produce plutonium at the Arak reactor by means of modifying the heavy water design so that it is not as capable of producing as much plutonium. Both sides also seem to recognize they may have different ideas about timelines, about the need for additional monitoring at declared and undeclared sites. But the key problem is this issue of setting limits on the uranium enrichment capacity. So they've got to come up with a formula that limits Iran's enrichment capability by enough to guard against a dash to nuclear weapons, but still addresses Iran's so-called practical civilian needs for civil nuclear power and research reactors in the future. So it's going to have to take into account several factors. And the thing that I don't think gets enough attention here in Washington is the rationale behind Iran's call for an increased amount of uranium enrichment over time. And when you hear the Iranian negotiators say in the press that we may need up to 100,000 IR-1 centrifuges, remember right now they just have 10,000 operating, what they're talking about is the possibility that the Bushehr reactor, which is the only operating reactor, power reactor in Iran today, may not be supplied by Russia, the fuel, after 2021. If that is the case, then theoretically, yes, Iran would need about 100,000 first-generation centrifuges to supply that reactor. But Russia could very well, and if Iran agrees, continue to supply the Bushehr reactor, thus obviating the need for all of those centrifuges. And that's a number that I think the P5 are certainly not going to agree to, that kind of capacity. Because obviously it's much more than the P5 plus 1 have been aiming for, and that time is only 8 years away. There are other reactors that Iran says it wants to build. Some of those include additional light water reactors to be built by Russia. Those could be supplied, again, the fuel by Russia. So this is going to be a key issue in these talks. And so there are a number of ways that they can solve this. And I'm just going to focus on what are some of the different combinations of ways to address these differences. First of all, it should be easy for the two sides. I think they both recognize, and this is reflected in the interim agreement from November, they should both be able to agree to limit Iran's uranium enrichment to levels of less than 5%, which is normal reactor fuel grades, rather than going up to the 20% level, which is much closer to bomb grade. They should be able to agree to keep Iran's stocks of enriched uranium to near zero. That means maybe in the 1,000 kilogram range, perhaps a little lower. They should be able to agree to halt production scale work at the smaller Fordo enrichment plant, which is underground, and reduce its potential to contribute to a dash to nuclear weapons. And so it could be converted to a research-only facility, thus addressing both the concerns of the P5 plus 1 and the Iranians. Now, in the first phase of the agreement, and we're talking about notional timelines here, and so I'm not being specific, but in the first several years, the two sides could or should be able to agree to reduce the enrichment capacity, the current enrichment capacity at or lower than current levels for an extended period. In later stages, what I would expect is that they may allow for appropriate increases in Iran's enrichment capabilities, so long as certain conditions are met and certain needs are demonstrated. Iran would have to address the concerns from the IAEA about past military dimensions. If Iran has foreign fuel supplies, they should not need an additional increase in their capacity. And there are other variations that might be pursued. And if you can see it here at the bottom, one of them was just put forward in a recent article in Arms Control Today, a journal of our organization, by a group of Princeton researchers that involves how to make a transition from the first generation IR1 centrifuges to the second generation centrifuges. Iran wants to build and pursue more efficient second generation centrifuges. So one option would be to phase out those first generation centrifuges, replace them with a smaller number of the second generation centrifuges, keeping the overall capacity to the same or lower over an initial period, maybe 5 years. That might provide an interesting, clever solution over the long term. In the final analysis, I think this is going to be extremely difficult to resolve the enrichment capacity issue and the Iran's practical needs issue. But the negotiators have a range of options available to them. It's technically complicated, but and ultimately they're going to have to make political judgments about breakout timelines and the practical needs for Iran. And let me stop there and turn it over to Steve and Bob.
Darrell, thank you very much. And we will now go to the issue of sanctions relief. Rob Litvak.
Well, thank you very much. Einstein famously said that politics is more difficult than physics. And if the Iranian nuclear challenge were, simply a trade-off between technology and transparency, talented negotiators could reach agreement. It wouldn't be straightforward, but it would be achievable. There are differences between the two sides on duration. We want longer, they want shorter. On breakout times, we need longer, they want shorter. On sanctions relief, it would be phased in. I think that this this characteristic of the Iranian nuclear challenge speaks to the proxy status of the nuclear issue on both sides. In Iran, the nuclear issue is a proxy, a surrogate, for a broader debate about Iran's relationship with the outside world, and in particular, the United States. Is Iran a revolutionary state or an ordinary country? You know, Henry Kissinger sort of famously said, does Iran want to be a nation or a cause? And there's been a persisting tension since the revolution about Iran's identity kind of revolving around this issue. Rouhani was elected with a mandate to kind of resolve the nuclear issue as part of a way for Iran to kind of rejoin the international community. Conservative elements within Iran view its radical foreign policy as a source of domestic legitimation. And there's this persisting tension. The supreme leader, has expressed fear that the nuclear issue could become a slippery slope, and that the nuclear demands on the nuclear issue could lead to further demands on other issues. And there's a strong suspicion that the U.S. goal vis-a-vis Iran is regime change. And in that respect, the nuclear issue is embedded in this broader context. It really goes to the core of Iran's identity. And it's that unresolved, persisting tension that has roiled kind of the nuclear diplomacy and made a resolution so elusive. Now, on the American side, the nuclear issue is also a surrogate. It's a surrogate for kind of a parallel debate about how the United States deals with these countries that after the Cold War were called rogue states. More recently, President Obama has called them outlier states. The rogue state concept kind of was based on the premise that the threat posed by these countries derived from the character of their regimes. And you couldn't really disentangle the behavior from the character of the regimes because the behavior was inextricably kind of linked to it. There's been the sort of parallel tension that one sees on the Iranian side. Iran, it's sort of a revolutionary state, or ordinary country. In America, should the U.S. objective in dealing with these states be to change their conduct or to change the regimes themselves? President Obama shifted from rogue state to outlier state to communicate that if Iran came into compliance with its international obligations under the NPT, it could rejoin the proverbial community of nations. But this tension persists, and one saw it after the interim agreement was concluded in the congressional legislation that was deflected by the Obama administration, legislation that would have started adding requirements vis-a-vis the missile program and state sponsorship of terrorism and human rights to the nuclear conduct in order to forestall or as a precondition for the lifting of sanctions. Iran's nuclear program is determined, it's incremental, but it's not a crash program to get a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. Iran's nuclear intentions, of course, are not unique to the Islamic Republic. They go back to the Shah's era. The CIA in the 1970s said that if the Shah had lived, Iran might well have become a nuclear weapon state. That's a debatable point, but I think what's not is not really a question of contention. Is that if Iran under the Shah had acquired nuclear weapons, the United States would have had a very different perception of that than nuclear weapons in the hands of the Islamic Republic, which makes, it has two implications. First, the Iranian program is not one in which the country feels it faces an existential threat for which nuclear weapons are the answer. In this respect, it's you could contrast it with Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, countries that perceive an existential threat to which nuclear weapons are the answer. Flowing from that is kind of an indicator of what Iran's nuclear intentions are, and this was bolstered by a quote that's oft-cited of Rafsanjani, that all Iran needs is to demonstrate kind of the ability to enrich uranium. It doesn't need to do anything more. Other people can draw conclusions, namely that it opens the door for a weapons option if Iran should seek to exercise it. So Iran faces no necessity for a weapon. a strategic, a hedge is arguably Iran's strategic sweet spot. It doesn't need to move off of that. To move towards weaponization would make Iran the issue in international relations, and it would provoke likely provoke a regional reaction, questions about what Saudi Arabia would do, among others. We are at the best chance for a nuclear deal now because sanctions have put meaningful pressure on Iran, and Rouhani was elected to improve the economy by lifting sanctions. A former U.S. official once said, Iran does not respond to pressure, but without pressure, Iran does not respond. How much is Iran willing to give up for sanctions relief? That's what's playing out now in the negotiations. Do the Iranians have a realistic assessment of what it will take to win, sanctions relief? How realistic is it of the United States, of us, to expect that they have a realistic expectation of the United States? It's hard for us to even read what's going on, living in Washington, what's going on here for them from their remove. This has implications for sanctions relief, which would be phased under an agreement. The dilemma is that sanctions take time to work, but they also take time to lift and have the impact of that lifting felt in society. The sanctions relief would be phased as part of the agreement, and they could be implemented through a presidential waiver or through congressional action. One of the complicating factors is the difficulty of disentangling the nuclear sanctions from the non-nuclear sanctions. If negotiations with Iran come to fruition in Geneva, the question is, can Rouhani sell that deal in Tehran? The outcome of the negotiations, whether they succeed and Iran gains meaningful sanctions relief in return for bounding its nuclear ambitions, or if they fail and the country's economy remains straitjacketed under punitive sanctions, has critical implications for regime stability. And here the decision will rest with the supreme leader. He must determine whether the costs of alienating the regime's power base, including the Revolutionary Guards, the intelligence services, and the paramilitary Basij, do those benefits, or do those costs of alienating these groups who might be kind of opposed to bounding the program meaningfully, do they outweigh the economic benefits of an agreement with the West? Iran's rejection or acceptance of a comprehensive nuclear deal with the P5+1 will turn on this calculus of decision by the supreme leader. The Obama administration's two-track strategy of pressure and engagement, which is one that built on the work of the second Bush administration, has sharpened that choice. What's the alternative to a deal that will leave both sides unhappy? The United States will be unhappy within our own politics. There'll be unhappiness because Iran will retain, through continued ability to enrich uranium, a hedge for a weapon, and a nuclear agreement will not address these other areas of concern: state sponsorship, terrorism, human rights. So it'll come under political attack on those grounds. And on the Iranian side, Iran has shown flexibility in the past. There's the famous episode in which Khomeini referred to swallowing poison and accepting the end of the Iran-Iraq war. But there will be a sense that Iran is giving up something, and what is it getting, and fears about the possibility that a nuclear deal could lead to kind of further demands and the slippery slope. I think what's important in Washington is that the surrogate status of this issue in Iran has to be appreciated, and its implications, taken into account as we formulate policy in dealing with the Iranian nuclear challenge. Thank you.
I think we've had three terrific presentations. We're going to go to the Q&A. I want to just, before we do so, say a word about, one, what I think a terrific series this has been, and I look forward to the sanctions session. But two, I think we've already heard there are so many other issues that need to be addressed in the context of this agreement. This whole question about what is the Iranian agenda. I think Zarif, the foreign minister, wants breakthrough relations with his Sunni neighbors and maybe the United States. Rouhani may be partway there. My guess is the supreme leader just wants a nuclear deal so that sanctions can come off and ease his pressure. So there's a whole series of issues of what Iran wants. There's issues about compliance. Will the United States be able to deliver the sanctions relief on a sustained basis? Will Iran comply with this agreement? The record in terms of the interim agreement is quite good. But some people say with Iran that when you sign the agreement, the negotiation starts. And that's going to lead a question about, so how do you enforce this agreement? What are the kinds of things that you can put in place that will convince Iran to stay inside the framework that is developed? How will the two countries sell the agreement to their own domestic constituencies? And sleeper issues like, what about the non-nuclear sanctions on Iran, which will come into play? And of course, on the flip side, what about the other activities that Iran does in terms of its relations with its neighbors and supporting of terrorism that are problems for the United States? So there is a whole plethora of rich issues, and I would hope, Robin, maybe the 8 sponsors would find a way to continue this program in the fall, because we certainly have a lot of things to talk about. So with that, let us begin questions. We'll ask people to raise their hands. We'll call on you. Microphones will then be brought to you. Please state your name and affiliation and your question, and you may direct it to the panel at large or any of the panel members. To the extent there are overflow audiences that are outside here, we will get some cards with questions from them, and we will integrate that into the flow as well. But let's start with a question from the audience here. Yes, sir. In the back.
Good morning. Thank you for this extremely interesting presentation. I'm Phil Schrafer. I'm a retired social worker with some international background. I would address this to whoever in the panel feels most familiar with Khomeini, the supreme leader. I would suggest that he has at least 3 different possible roles. One is either a dictator like in the North Korean situation, control of the elements of government, or 2, he's a square dance director who wants to keep his dancers happy, wants to balance the military with the spiritual, with the left, and so on. Or 3, he's simply in a chaotic society. He's riding a horse and trying to stay in the saddle. Thank you.
How do we get a mic down here to Raleigh or Rob?
I think maybe Bob.
Well, I've really benefited enormously being at the Wilson Center and being a consumer of the excellent meetings we've had at the Wilson Center on Iran, 189 meetings, I believe it is. A number of the speakers in this audience are like very well positioned to answer that question. And so I'm a consumer of the literature. And one thing I've been impressed by is this sort of complex and subtle interrelationship between Iran's domestic and foreign policy and the role of the supreme leader, whose title I think we have to take at face value, and how he balances among the competing power groups in Iran. And I think what's brought us to this point is that, and you see these waves from Khatami to Ahmadinejad to Rouhani of kind of waves, kind of a cyclic, pendulum, whatever metaphor you want to use, of reform reaction, of board of reform reaction. And it was a Rouhani election, which, was driven by kind of a need to kind of get the economy in order, which means sanctions relief, which created political space for negotiations. And there's a rare consensus in the elite for negotiations. Whether that will translate into a consensus for an agreement, given this embedded quality that I emphasized in my remarks, the surrogate status for this bigger question, kind of remains to be seen. And the calculus of decision, which there are a number of people or the Iran watchers would have a really informed judgment on, of whether it'll come down to this sort of trade-off between the political costs, and Cheryl Bakash has written about kind of, and this essay's on the Primer, website, about how the supreme leader has cultivated relations with the Basij and the Revolutionary Guard as sort of a source of kind of regime security and legitimacy for his own rule, of whether he's willing to come at odds with elements within those groups that might be hostile to a deal with the implications of an agreement with the great Satan, or whether he would go along with a deal to gain the benefits of economic, sanctions relief inside, kind of with the Rouhani faction. I think one pitfall, just to close on, is there was the period in the autumn of 2009 where there were negotiations, technical negotiations in Vienna over kind of an aspect of the nuclear program that when it got back to Tehran, it couldn't be sold there. So I think there is a question of, can a deal, how will it play in Tehran? And there, it's up to the supreme leader.
Just one quick thought on that is, I'm not an Iran domestic expert by any means, but it is interesting that over the last several weeks, the supreme leader has openly tried to quell criticism from the right about these negotiations and tried to express support for the effort, which is very different from what we've seen in the past. And that just underscores the fact that this is a historic moment when, as you said, Bob, all the stars seem to be aligning. Now the negotiators just need to find a way to resolve these issues.
Charles Duffer is there.
Charlie?
Thank you. My name is Charles Delfer. I have experience from Iraq. It seems to me that the question of weaponization is getting short shrift. We now have an acronym for possible military activities, or whatever it's called. It seems to me, unless Secretary Kerry can make a very, very clear and convincing explanation of what Iran did with respect to weaponization, he's going to be in a very difficult position to explain how we've walked the program back or to define what the breakout time is. And even if he can, then the Intelligence Committee is going to have a tough time explaining how in the 2007 NIE, what all that data suggested. So I guess my question would be, maybe to you, Steve, having endured the 2007 NIE process, how are we going to get around that issue if we don't have a very clear, forthright declaration by Iran, verified by the United States, about where they got on weaponization?
Daryl, I'll let you
I'll take a whack at that. Look, this, Charlie, you know very much about this. I think we need to look at the PMD issue, the possible military dimensions issue, in context, and we need to, I think, acknowledge that Iran did work in the past, and some of that may continue. That's what the NIE, National Intelligence Estimate, says. And I think we need to operate on the basis that they have some acquired knowledge. That's not going to go away. Second thing is, Iran is not going to, at this stage, after years of denying it was pursuing a nuclear weapons program, now admit that, oh yes, we were. It's politically impossible for Rouhani, the supreme leader, and it's the IAEA, not the United States, that is going to verify the, or I should say, to judge the level of cooperation between from the Iranians to the agency about these issues. And I agree with John. The agency is going to have to prioritize what the most important issues are, and their goal needs to be to understand as much as possible about what went on so that they can, going forward in the future, understand what they need to focus on in terms of their additional protocol monitoring efforts and other monitoring efforts. So I think we need to think about what is it that this process is going to produce. I think that at this stage is about the best we can achieve. And just a final point is that many people are asking, how can we have a nuclear agreement with Iran by July 20th if the IAEA investigation is not done? The reality is that the investigation is not going to be done by July 20th. Reason one is the agency needs the time to go back and forth with the Iranians to get a full and accurate set of information about these issues. The agency can't be rushed. And the Iranians, as far as I can see, are deliberately slow-rolling this so that any information that does come out in this investigation can't be used as leverage against them in these comprehensive agreement negotiations. So I'm just kind of describing reality. That's how I
Let me make
see
a
it.
couple comments, and then we'll go to Barbara, because we could, if we had all three panelists on, or
Yeah.
including me on every question, we'll never get through this. First thing they can do, and Secretary Kerry's got to do, is don't use a euphemism. It's not possible. There was military activity, and if he does not come very forcefully and say, we know there is military activity and we're going to get to the bottom of it, he's going to start on the back foot. Secondly, I think the challenge for the negotiators is you're not going to want to hold up the agreement until the resolution of the IA process. It doesn't make any sense. But can you have a phasing of sanctions relief that would reflect expected progress on resolving the weaponization issues? And if they don't build it into the agreement, you can be sure that Congress, in its review of the agreement, will build it into the agreement for them. So I think that's really the way the struggle the negotiators are going to have. Barbara Slavin.
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council and allmonitor.com. Thank you to our illustrious panel. This, I think, is probably directed also to Steve and to Rob Litvak. Darrell, you said the stars were aligned, but one star that doesn't seem aligned is the one in Tel Aviv. What role do you think the Israelis are going to play? They've made a lot of noise, certainly as the negotiating process has gone on, but do you think they will accept an agreement that provides a 6-month to a 1-year breakout? And how will they interact with the Congress in terms of trying to impede implementation of an agreement if they don't like the terms?
Rob, do you want to start?
Well, I think that the differences, have been evident, throughout this process and what preceded it. You go back to the Netanyahu and Obama speeches at AIPAC, where Netanyahu, is focused on, denial of Iran any hedge capability. That means zero enrichments, and there's been some sentiment and support for that, in Congress. I don't think, that is a realistic objective now. I mean, given the number of centrifuges and where we're at, maybe zero enrichment was an option at some earlier period, but no longer. President Obama said it on weaponization, which is, quite at the other end of the continuum. The Israeli Prime Minister is not happy with it, but really, if there is an agreement that has broad international support, they would not have, politically it would be difficult to kind of, they could express unhappiness, but they would be in a situation where they'd have to go along with it, particularly given that their unilateral military option, if it, to the extent it existed, it really, that the window on that is more or less closed, given the multiple redundant sites and the difficulty of the mission, for Israel. So they would press their American ally for assurances about the agreement and vigorous, verification and punitive measures for noncompliance.
I think that's basically right. I think Netanyahu is using his leverage to try to put pressure on the negotiators to get as tough an agreement as they can in terms of length of the time on breakout and as reduced capability or capacity as possible. I think you will see that shift to begin talking about the things that are outside the agreement. What are we going to do to ensure that it is enforced and that Iran is deterred from trying to violate it? And that's where you're going to get the discussions about, from the Congress, pre-authorization of military force, if there's a breach of the agreement, snapback sanctions. I think there's a whole discussion that we're going to get into, and the Israelis will encourage about, so what is the set of, what is going to surround this agreement to ensure that the Iranians are willing to comply? But in the end of the day, I think they will have to take an agreement accepted by the international community. We have 25 people in an overflow room, and they've submitted some questions, and I'd like to go through 3 of them quickly, one for each of the panelists, and then we'll go back to the audience. And let's start, if we could, John, with this one. Put on your fortune teller's hat. What is the chance of negotiations becoming successful, if not before July 20, then in some period of time after that? You know,
my Karnak
there we go.
Show my age. Look, everybody in town is taking bets. I understand Daryl has an office pool in terms of when they will reach agreement, and I think the pool stretches out to January 19th, 17, 18. I mean, I find it very difficult to believe that the negotiators will complete a deal by July 20th. I don't think that is actually a bad thing. I think both the Iranian leadership and the American leadership would like a deal as quickly as they can. But I don't think that, at least in the United States, we've done a very good job preparing the field for an agreement. So I think a little bit more time would be valuable. It would show that, in fact, we weren't really to just jump at a deal. We continue to work this. So politically, there's some value there. And they're really tough problems that they're trying to work out, as we've outlined here today. So the challenge is, for those of you that remember, we've done this before, and we had a suspension or freeze of Iran's nuclear program back in early 2000s when President Rouhani was then the head of the National Security Council or the head nuclear negotiator. And he was politically vulnerable because the deal kept stretching out and they were still frozen and they weren't getting any real relief from the sanctions. So they're not going to go for that again. We probably have the ability to extend for another 6 months, I would argue. But I think then we really start to reach the limits of political trust, because partly this is the negotiation itself is a trust exercise. And so I think we've got some time, but it's not unlimited.
That question was from Hiroki Wada of the Mainichi newspapers. Thank you. This question comes from two sources, one identified, and it's one of the questions from Jihan Chun of the Wilson Center. Daryl, let's take this on. If John is wrong, and in fact we don't get a negotiated outcome here, what are going to be the consequences and the sort of the elephant in the room? Are all options still on the table?
Well, all options are always still on the table in theory, but if they don't reach an agreement, a comprehensive agreement, midnight July 20th or early hours of July 21, I think there are two scenarios to look at. One is, do they come out and do a press conference that says, we're very close to an agreement, we're very optimistic that we can achieve it with a little bit more time, but the negotiators are all tired and sleepy, and we have to consult with capitals, and we need a few more days or a couple more weeks. That's one kind of delay that I think is surmountable. Another variation is that we need to extend the interim agreement by 6 months, and we're going to work harder. That would indicate that there are much more severe differences, and I think the political pressure inside of Iran against the deal might mount, and the pressure in the United States for taking further action on sanctions would also mount. And that would decrease the possibility that would see a final agreement. And then there, of course, is the possibility that, okay, they don't agree on a final agreement by the end of 2014, and then, all bets are off, and I think we're looking at a worsening situation for both sides because Iran's capabilities increase, and the sanctions, tough sanctions regime on Iran continues.
Great, thank you. And finally for Rob, this is an interesting question. Again, someone unidentified, but if we get an agreement and it is not part of a broader change of behavior on the part of the Iranian regime, and they continue other things that give us pause, activities in Syria, support for terrorism and the like, and Congress in its wisdom decides additional sanctions are needed in order to deter this kind of activity by Iran in these other areas, what is the impact and how do you manage that impact on a nuclear agreement?
Well, I mean, this, I think, really goes to Iranian expectations of the United States and suspicions of America's intentions, that we have, these overlapping tranches of sanctions, and disentangling them, and then ascribing kind of impact, saying, you've come into compliance with nuclear, obligations under the NPT. These are lifted, and here are the impact. But meanwhile, these sanctions in other areas with good reason, remain on Iran. I think that, it's a complication to orchestrate kind of lifting of sanctions here that will have impact there. This issue of will it be through a presidential waiver or through congressional action? Will they have an impact in Iran? And then with the Iranians making clear that their behavior in other areas are the cause of these continued U.S. sanctions. There's been some discussion in the European Union, which has its own kind of sanctions implementation, that they would lift theirs, and there could be some differentiation between kind of what the impact of the lifting of the EU sanctions and those in the United States. But I think it goes to the kind of whatever metaphor, the Rubik's Cube, the complicated kind of aspect of our relationship. And I think that's something that we have to really take into account, because even if we are able to gain Iranian compliance on the nuclear question, these other issues will remain. Human rights, certainly, and its state sponsorship of terrorism, which in practice is translated into their relationship with Hezbollah, which is one they attach high value to and are not going to jettison.
Other questions for the room? Yes, ma'am. Way in the back, last row. Yes, you.
Hi. Thank you so much for the speak. I'm Neda Bostani from AAAS, Center for Science Diplomacy. One of the issues which actually you mentioned is that how can we make sure that Iran would stay in the framework? And if Rouhani is not a president anymore in the future, how can we be sure that the next president would actually respect? I was wondering if the US think about science as the way that can be a guarantee, like building worldwide science center in Iran or increasing bilateral US-Iran collaboration. I'm working on US-Iran Environmental Forum, and I would think that building such a huge science center and increase bilateral collaboration would actually guarantee such a worry. Like Iran would stay in this framework because Iranian would respect the science, and scientists speak the same language all over the world. So
John?
Does US want to actually do something to value science diplomacy in this
Thank you.
regard?
John,
Yeah,
you want to take that?
it's a very good point, and I have good reason to believe that part of what the U.S. and the P5+1 are trying to use with the negotiations is exactly that concept. How do we broaden this out and create continuing incentives for Iran to see value in the plan 5, 10, 15 years from now? The only words that you've used that I wouldn't agree with are, well, how do we guarantee? There are no guarantees in life. I mean, you always try and protect yourself. The bottom line is we want an agreement that is, we are no worse off if and when a violation comes than we would be if we never had an agreement. We don't want to be sort of a sucker over the 5, 10, 15-year period. But are there things we could do with Iran scientifically, technically? Absolutely. One of the areas that one of our researchers at CNS has talked about is early earthquake detection. Something that the Iranians are very, very worried about that would really benefit from. We've talked about engaging the Japanese on this because they have a very good relationship with Iran. They have a very extensive experience with earthquake detection and preparation. So there are things like that from the scientific and the practical value that we can engage in. There are some challenges on nuclear cooperation, and we ran into this with the North Korean agreement as well. We do not have a legal agreement that would allow us to share nuclear technology with Iran, even though we used to. And that's how we gave them a nuclear reactor that produces medical isotopes, University of Tehran. It's no longer in force. I'm willing to guess that the Congress is unlikely to approve an agreement anytime soon, although we'll be up on the Hill later, so I'll ask. But that doesn't mean that the French or the Germans or the Russians couldn't engage in that sort of cooperation. So it's part of the larger collective discussion that I think we could and should be having.
Other questions? Here and then here. Sir?
Thank you. Glad to be here. Nice to see you, gentlemen. I'm Professor Wayne Glass from the University of Southern California, former foreign policy advisor to Senator Jeff Bingaman, and student of international agreements and treaties and their fate in the Congress. You referred to the agreed framework and the disaster that sort of followed that, much of which I think is explained by congressional partisanship over the period of time in which that was at least hoped to be implemented. The question of partisanship is close to all of us here in the city as we watch this unfold. And I think it's pretty clear that partisan politics are going to play a role in how this agreement, should it happen, unfolds. My question is, and in some cases, maybe the most successful and sustained agreements have been one in which both sides of the aisle have been engaged in the negotiations, track one, track two, to keep things on track. So my question to you, living outside the Beltway on the West Coast, to what extent has the opposition or the party been engaged in advising and participating in the negotiations concerning this agreement to date?
Daryl, do you want to answer that?
Well, it's a good question, and it's one that we'll be hearing more about when we talk to folks on the Hill later today. I mean, the way I look at it is, this is a very intense and delicate multilateral negotiation. I'm aware of the fact that the head of the U.S. delegation, Wendy Sherman, has come back on a fairly regular basis to brief on a bipartisan basis the leaders of the key committees. But as far as I know, there hasn't been extensive briefings for the rank and file after every meeting. And I think, in my opinion, I mean, that's probably the appropriate level of consultation, because the United States is not the only negotiating partner at the table. You can't negotiate in public. And Congress does have a lot of opportunities to ask direct questions of the State Department, the White House, about details. So, but that's where it's been today. I think what is very important, and what the White House is really going to have to up its game on, is when and if this agreement is concluded, it is going to have to work very hard to consult with everyone on the Hill, to answer the many questions that are going to be there, to help them understand, okay, why they did this, why they did that, what are the risks, and also, most importantly, this deal is not going to satisfy anyone, in the sense that there's always going to be something in this agreement that somebody's going to complain about. It's not going to satisfy me. But we have to think about, and Congress needs to consider, what is the alternative? We don't want a bad deal. I don't think that the negotiators are going to come back with a bad deal, but we certainly don't want a situation in which there are no limits on Iran's capabilities. The risk of war increases as those capabilities improve, and I think ultimately that's what Congress is going to have to consider as they look at the whole package.
Just a word here. I mean, I think it is very important that the Secretary of State is a recently retired senator with long ties in the Senate. I think my former boss, if New Start's any indication, although his ties are not as recent as those of John Kerry, will be extremely important in working the Senate. But I don't think we should kid ourselves. And Wayne, you're a long enough observer of this. We could have had members of Congress in the room sworn to secrecy, and I don't think it really would matter in building support for this deal. I mean, this is whatever we negotiate is going to be unpopular, and the president is going to be vociferously attacked for having negotiated with this regime and having ceded so much ground, because that's the environment we're in. And if you don't believe me, just look at the debate over the recent POW release. Because in many cases, they can criticize with impunity. The question in my mind is, what does Congress have to do to make this deal stick? And I think the administration has very carefully learned the lesson from the agreed framework. There's no money that the U.S. Congress will have to appropriate. The sanctions issue is going to be one that has to be untangled and is very complicated, but the president does have a lot of waiver authority. But I think they are eager to try and find champions on both sides of the leadership that will at least try to manage the criticism. I hate to say this much in the way the Supreme Leader has been trying to do in Tehran to try and quell the criticism from the right, but he may have a little bit more success in it than President Obama might.
Couple thoughts on that. One is there are going to be problems I think on both the Democratic and Republican side. I don't think this is going to be a clean split, Republicans against Democrats before. Secondly, I think you're going to have a big issue about congressional versus presidential prerogatives. There's going to be a separations of powers issue, and Congress is going to want to play a role, and the administration is going to have to figure out how to give it a role without unsticking the agreement. And I think that may get a little harder after November if the Republicans control both the House and the Senate. I think the only way in the end of the day they're going to be able to sell it is in a context of the kinds of enforcement and deterrence measures I talked, the package that goes around the agreement, reassurances to allies in the region that this is not consenting to Iranian hegemony as long as they don't have nuclear weapons. And finally, I think there's going to have to be a very serious conversation in both Tehran and in Washington about what are the alternatives if either side rejects that agreement. And we can have this conversation again. I think it's another topic maybe in the fall. I would say that the plan Bs for both Iran and the United States are poor, and but that the Iranians are better than ours. And that's a conversation we can have. But I think we're going to have a very clear conversation of what the alternatives are to the agreement, because they're not great. We have one last question, and then I'm going to give each panel member 2 minutes to make final comments, and then we'll be done. Sir.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hassan. I was born in Tehran. Many years ago, when hostages were taken in Iran, and according to the agreement with the Carter administration, Warren Christopher was the person that made possible for the hostage release. And in the agreement was this, that when the hostages leave Iranian airspace, all the assets of Iranians that they were blocked or frozen will be released back to the Iranians. So this happened. So when Iran demanded the money, Christopher and the team told them to go back and read the agreement. And so they went and read the agreement and said, oh yeah, there's a clause here saying $500 million should be left in an escrow in case anybody has any kind of a complaint about Iran, so this money will pay from the escrow. Iran said, okay, we will leave $500 million in escrow, give us the rest of it. Now listen to this. They said, we don't trust you. If we give you the money, you may not replenish the $500 million to pay for anybody that is going to be complaining to you. Up to this date, not a penny of that money has been returned to the Iranian people. And now we're talking about confidence building, and the fact sheet here, tensions over timeline. And then article number 1 says, how long will it take to make a deal last? And in there it says that there is a big, big problem because we, United States, the biggest power in the world, the richest nation in the whole world, does not trust 85 million people, which we don't even think they are.
I don't know the details on that. Does anyone here know?
One more thing I want to say just before I finish. The month of July is going to be the fasting month for the Muslims throughout the world.
Right.
And the 20th of July is going to be the highest of that.
Good point.
So you may not get any deal.
There you go. That's the kind of practical considerations you have to keep in mind. Anyone want to say a quick word, and then we'll wrap up on the...
Just a quick thought. I mean, your example, which I'm not familiar with in detail, I mean, it just shows that this is a relationship between two countries that is not built on trust since 1979. But to make another analogy, you know, we still don't trust Russia, okay, even after the end of the Cold War. But it has been possible to work with Russia to work out agreements on issues of common concern that affect the security of both of our countries. So we're not talking about trusting the Iranians, trusting the Americans in order to reach this agreement. It's not going to be an agreement built on trust, but on verification and over time, you know, actions that each side is going to take. I mean.
So let me go in reverse order, just sort of a minute a pop of each of our panelists before we wind up. Rob?
I would just kind of reiterate the main point of my presentation, that is the kind of proxy or surrogate status of the nuclear issue on both sides. In Iran, it's surrogate for sort of its sorting out its relationship with the outside world, the United States. For the United States, whether dealing with these countries it requires addressing sort of just their conduct or their character of the regime. I think this dynamic is in play in terms of the implementation of or the possibility of attaining an agreement, which would, as has been discussed, would leave both sides unhappy. It would leave the United States unhappy because it would not address other areas of concern. It would leave Iran, elements in Iran unhappy because of the limitations or the concessions that would have to give up to achieve an agreement, and the view that this is, could be a slippery slope of further demands and may not be reciprocated in terms of the kind of sanctions relief that these expectations have been generated with the Rouhani election.
Thank you. Daryl?
Well, I just want to pick up on a good point that you made a couple of minutes ago, Steve, that I think is important to consider with this agreement and how it's assessed at the end of the day, which is, many people have said no deal is better than a bad deal. But I think both sides are going to try to get the best deal they can if there is going to be a deal. And we have to consider, as you said, what is the alternative? So just to sketch out briefly in detail related to breakout and enrichment, I mean, what happens if there is no deal at the end of 2014? Basically, there would be no verifiable limits on Iran's uranium enrichment capacity, and it would probably be deploying in the next 2 to 3 years more efficient types of centrifuges that could increase that that capacity further. Its enriched uranium stockpiles would probably grow, not shrink, and the time it would take Iran to break out would decrease, not increase. IAEA inspections would continue as they currently exist, but we would not get the additional types of monitoring and inspections that we really want to have in order to guard against a secret program. So the alternatives, as you said, are not pretty, and this is a key moment when many, but not all, the stars are aligned for the negotiators.
John? Just 2 quick points. One, on this question of, what does Secretary Kerry have to lay out there, and do we have to play gotcha with the Iranians and show that we proved they had a nuclear program? I think the United States is going to say what it has to say, right? I mean, we've stopped their nuclear weapon program dead in its tracks. The Iranians are going to say, see, we've had our rights acknowledged. I don't think it's necessary to force Iran in public to acknowledge what they have done, as long as they satisfy the IAEA privately and give the type of access that's needed to give a full picture. And we have examples where that has been done in private to the satisfaction of the United States. I had a piece in the National Interest a couple of weeks ago saying, do we want success or satisfaction? And you can find that on either our webpage or the IranFactFile.org webpage. The other point I want to make here on trust, there are varying levels of trust, and you're going to get to certain levels over time, but you will never get all the way there. And I'll give you 2 great examples. When the decision was made to rearm West Germany in the early 1950s, there were people who thought the president was insane.
The adage that things can only get better. Yeah. Only get better. There's another rock bottom.